This morning's reflection will be presented by Debbie Rake, Diane Austin, and Steve Simpson.
Variations in how our minds and our bodies work are part of the vast range of human diversity and contribute to individual uniqueness. Society determines which of these variations are considered typical and defines the rest as disabilities. These definitions are fluid over time and across cultures. Approximately 20% of Americans today live with disabilities. Everyone who lives to great age will become disabled. Everyone. Most medical and legal definitions of disability are couched in terms of defects and deficiencies rather than variation. This perspective can serve to reinforce the social stigma, inequality, isolation, and marginalization experienced by people living with disabilities. In our Unitarian Universalist worship, we celebrate our diversity, and disability is part of the rich diversity of human existence. However, when we see that disability may limit or exclude someone, we realize that we have an obligation based on our first principle to try to remove any barriers we perceive. It is the purpose of the AIM team to name such barriers and then to ameliorate them. As the first speaker, it's my job to kind of define our terms, and as a part-time English teacher, I find that job entirely satisfying. So, disability. A physical, mental, cognitive, or developmental condition that limits a person's ability to participate in typical daily activities and interactions. That seems pretty clear, but it puts the emphasis on what a person cannot do rather than on what they can. The community of disabled people has suggested that the term differently abled is a better choice. When talking about people who are not differently abled, I would suggest using the word typical. Sometimes we default to the word normal, but the opposite of normal is abnormal, which is definitely negative. Members of the autism community use typical to refer to kids who don't have autism, and I like it because it's not value-loaded. Accessibility means ease of approach, use, or entrance. Accessibility allows all people to go wherever they want to go, do whatever they need to do, and enter or leave any space without hindrance. It's a question of the modification of physical space or objects so that they work for anyone. We all know examples of these because we see them every day. Curb cuts, handicap bathrooms, Braille labels in elevators, and so on. Inclusion is different. To include means to take in as a part of a whole or a group. If you are included, you are part of the group, part of the congregation, part of the community. And it doesn't say a conditional part, or sort of, or maybe. You are part of us. Inclusion is trickier to talk about than access. Accessibility is primarily about physical matters. Inclusion is about attitudes, about how we feel and how we welcome and how we are with someone else. Attitudes can present the most important barrier to engagement of people with disabilities in congregational life, and they can be the hardest thing to measure. Accessibility requires an adjustment of the physical environment. Inclusion can require an adjustment of the social environment. Accessibility requires that we be open-minded. Inclusion requires that we be open-hearted.
Thank you, Debbie. This morning, I'm going to talk about why we care as Unitarian Universalists, why we care about accessibility and inclusion, and how this relates to our first and second principles especially. Along the way, I will tell you a little bit about equal access, which is spelled with 2 capital U's in the middle, and the Accessibility and Inclusion Ministry Program, AIM for short, and what the AIM team here at Westside has been doing. Equal Access is an organization of Unitarian Universalists living with disabilities, with families, friends, and allies, coming together to enable the full engagement of people with disabilities in Unitarian Universalist communities and the broader society. The Accessibility and Inclusion Ministry Program is a collaboration of the UUA with Equal Access and is committed to full inclusions of persons with disabilities in UU congregations. About our first principle, the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Ann Parker wrote, "Unitarian Universalists affirm the inherent worth and dignity of each person as a given of faith, an unshakable conviction calling us to self-respect and respect for others. Every person has a unique perspective, talents, and gifts that are valuable to our community. If we are accessible, it is easier for a person with a disability to participate in our programs independently and with dignity. That includes the accessibility of our website and our communications so that people know what we're doing. Of course, getting in the door is not enough. If we do not include and welcome persons with disabilities in our programs, in our social events, in our social justice work, our community will be missing out. Just as we would be missing out if we were not inclusive with respect to race and with LGBTQ identity. Our first principle implies that all should be included and provided with an accessible church that makes everyone welcome. Steve will later talk about some things we can do as individuals to be more welcoming and inclusive. About our second principle, the Reverend Emily Gage wrote, "Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations," which is our second principle, points us towards something beyond inherent worth and dignity. It points us to the larger community. It gets at collective responsibility. It reminds us that treating people as human beings is not simply something we do one-on-one, but something that has systemic implications and can inform our entire cultural way of being. Compassion is something that we can act on individually. We can demonstrate openness, give people respect, and treat people with kindness on our own. But we need one another to achieve equity and justice. The history of the treatment of persons with disabilities is not pretty and cannot be ignored. Have you ever heard someone say, "There were no kids with disabilities when I was in school"? For persons over a certain age, it may be true. In most states, children with disabilities were not allowed to attend public schools until 1975, and inclusion in regular classrooms was not typical until new laws were passed in 1990. In Texas and in many other states, special education and support services for students continue to suffer from caps on eligibility and underfunding. Persons with disabilities also struggle with employment. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in 2018, only 30% of the disabled ages 16 to 64 were in the workforce, versus 74% for non-disabled in that age group. Other social issues that disproportionately affect persons with disabilities come from the Equal Access AIM website. There's voter disenfranchisement with inaccessible voting places or ballots. There's an increased rate of poverty, difficulty accessing health care, reproductive justice issues, including termination of parental rights due to disability. And despite the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, there are many businesses that are inaccessible. But the enforcement of the ADA requires lawsuits. There is no other enforcement mechanism. In the criminal justice system, those with disabilities are disproportionately incarcerated and subjected to violence at the hands of the police, especially those with mental illness. People with disabilities are subject to increased risks of abuse in institutions and from caregivers, and children with disabilities are increased targets of bullying at schools. Disability is the main reason for housing discrimination complaints. And there is a lack of accessible public transportation, cabs, and rides such as Uber and Lyft. As you can see, many social justice issues affect those with disabilities even more than the general population. Individual compassion and kindness are valuable and important, but they are not enough. Our second principle calls us to work for systemic changes so that persons with disabilities can thrive at Westside and in the larger community. Now I'd like to talk about the AIM program here at Westside and what we are doing. Last year, we started the process of becoming an AIM congregation. The first step is assessing where we are. We completed a detailed accessibility survey last summer. It was pretty straightforward. We got out our rulers, we measured the width of doorways, we counted accessible bathrooms, we checked the angles of our ramps and whether we had railings. We looked at, whether we had hearing assistance or had Braille hymnals available or other means. We've been able to incorporate some things that we learned right away. For example, making the kitchen design more accessible, encouraging the use of microphones at meetings, adding armchairs in the congregation so that persons who have difficulty standing without arms have something available. Other solutions are going to be more complex, like how are we going to add van accessible parking and many other issues which we will have to prioritize and decide what we want to do as a congregation. We also received additional input about accessibility from the congregation through a questionnaire, and that is helping us set priorities and see what congregational concerns are. We are now working on our inclusion assessment. As Debbie mentioned, inclusion has been proven harder to measure. There's no ruler that can measure inclusion. We realized quickly that it touches every aspect of Westside's programming: leadership, worship themes and teaching, children's religious education, our social programs, pastoral care, communications, and social justice work. And we needed to talk to lots of people on just about every committee at Westside. And you know that committee list is long. So far, we found good attitudes. How can I help? But not necessarily awareness of things that can be done, priorities, policies, or training on specific ways to be more inclusive. Westside already has many active members who have disabilities, and they have taken important roles here. For example, Gerald Thomas greeted us this morning with his wonderful smile, and Liz Campbell is a leader of the forum and is on our AIM team. We have a good start, and we have a good heart, but I think we can do more. Once our assessments are complete, the AIM team will develop a plan to improve accessibility and inclusion at Westside based on the needs and priorities that we find. Our job is to develop workshops and projects to occur over several years, with some focused on accessibility, some on inclusion, and some on social justice. We will be asking for your participation in these projects and workshops as our plans unfold. I would like to recognize everyone on the AIM team. We had Diane Nixon, Liz Campbell, Steve Simpson, Debbie Rake, myself, Diane Austin. Our other members include Amber Richardson, who's here today, Steve Prismas, Matthew Ireland, Sue Spell, and we have 2 consultants who are willing to give us feedback, Bob Rake and Mary Hennon. If you are interested in joining our work, and you yourself experience a disability, or you're a close family member or caregiver of someone with a disability, we would welcome your input and your help. So please say anyone on our committee. Now I will turn it over to Steve Simpson, who will address the question, what can I do?
Good morning. Thank you very much, Diane, for the introduction and for your work as our committee lead. Also, thanks very much to Debbie for her thoughtful comments. I think it's a great connection to think about accessibility as requiring an open mind, typically a very technical sense of what it means to be accessible, but maybe the more thought-provoking concept of inclusion requiring an open heart. My purpose here in the final third of our reflection is to very quickly highlight through the voice of some individuals who have shared some experiences related to being perceived as having a disability that might give us some prioritized or action things or thoughts to take with us, especially as it relates to our principle, the first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. So the question becomes, given that there's structural things that we can't individually address when we leave Westside today, there are thousands of interactions we can have with individuals both in our church community and in the wider community in the coming days, weeks, and months. So here are some thoughts to consider as we go forward. The question being, what can we do to ensure that we lean into and live out this principle in our daily lives? So Janelle, if you'll go ahead and play that video, please.
Yeah.
Right over here.
Yep, that's good.
Okay.
Awesome.
We have disabilities, and you're not sure how to act around us.
How to be when we're in the room.
Well, we're here to help.
The most important thing to remember
isn't the disability part. We are people.
We are people.
Just start by thinking, how would you feel if it was you?
Would you want to be passed over for a promotion?
Patronized.
Pitied, ignored.
When all you want to do is be treated like an equal? Would you only want people to see your disability when they look at you?
I don't think so.
How should you be around us?
Be honest.
Be relaxed. Be funny.
Be respectful.
Be genuine.
Be yourself.
Just be yourself. Be you.
just be cool, because as you can clearly see, we are.
Help us celebrate Indiana Disability Awareness Month.
Please show your support by sharing this video.
So could it be as simple as just being cool? Maybe. I wanted to share a couple more individual glimpses of an experience that if you haven't had, you might not be able to recognize. Some concerns of life experience that I want to just speak to on behalf of individuals. This is sourced from an article that was in The Guardian, just in case you're curious. So Anne says, "What can you do? Please don't call me brave." And I'll just expand a little bit. She says, "I do cringe when people marvel at me, saying I must be brave or inspiring just because I'm out shopping on my own. You must be so brave. I find this phrase very patronizing. Don't say this to me unless I've wrestled a tiger, or a crocodile, or have done something extraordinary like fly to the moon and back, I don't see how I can be inspiring by just getting on with my life. Now, Joshua, what can you do? Please don't use baby talk. It's irritating when people talk to me as if I'm a child. They spot my hearing aids, and they suddenly think they need to revert to loud, slow baby talk for me to understand them. I struggle with my hearing, not my comprehension. I can ask you to speak up, or more clearly, if I need you to. Alice, don't ask me what my disabilities are. I wish people would stop asking me what my disabilities are. It's intrusive and unnecessary. You only need to know what my access needs are, not why I have those needs. You wouldn't ask a non-disabled person to give details about their medical history, so why should it be different for me? If I want you to know, I'll tell you. Devarshi, please don't help me without asking. The one thing I wish people would stop doing is assuming I need assistance without asking. From trying to help me lock up my bike to my food being served already cut up, it's patronizing, frustrating, and can sometimes be embarrassing. Placida, don't give misplaced advice. People say, hey, when's your leg gonna get better? My favorite is, sister, come to my church, you'll be healed as God will forgive your sins. I also get, shall I call you a taxi? While I'm walking towards my car. I find that the general public have good intentions, but seriously, think before dishing out misplaced advice to me about how you think about my disability. And Lottie. Lottie says, please don't assume my disability defines me. It's frustrating when people see physical disability as anything other than a few logistical difficulties that I have to be creative with and find ways around. It doesn't define my motivations, my ambition, or my identity. So given the reflection on testimonials from people living with what I might assume are challenges, I have to be conscious of how I can lean into my principle to understand and respect the worth and inherent dignity of every person. So I urge you to, along with me, as we proceed in the coming days, weeks, and months, let's commit as a congregation to being cool, embracing the opportunity to live out these principles in our daily actions through both our words and those actions. Amen.
Thank you, Debbie, Diane, Steve. Really enjoyed that.